Such a pleasure to be here on P2. I'm Charlie Muirhead. I'm the founder and CEO of CogX, and it's an incredible privilege to be here hosting our 6th annual CogX Festival and our first Global Leadership Summit. So I just wanted to firstly say thank you all for being here. It's fantastic to have Alexandr Wang here, the founder and the CEO of Scale AI, and very much looking forward to the conversation. I'm sure Alex is going to be live in a second, and we've got 30 minutes. And so what we'd like to do is take 20 minutes to ask some questions, and then we're going to throw it over to you for your own questions. And so there'll be somebody here with a mic. Just put your hand up, and we'll try and get to them, as many of them as we possibly can. So without further ado, Alexandr, are you there? Now, I'm not sure
Hello.
you'll be able to see me. We can see you, and we can hear you.
Amazing. I can see you just fine. There might be a little bit of a delay. So
fantastic. So, Alexandr, tell us a little bit about Scale AI. I don't know how many people in the audience have heard of Scale AI before? Okay, so a few, but tell us the story.
Yeah, so I grew up, I'm American. I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and my parents were both physicists, so they worked at a national lab here in the States, working on all sorts of cool physics and science. And so I grew up, inspired by science and technology in a fundamental way. And so when I was sort of in college at MIT, I wanted to work on the most impactful technology that I possibly could, which at the time, this was back in 2015 and 2016, clearly felt like artificial intelligence. This was the year when DeepMind came out with AlphaGo, which is sort of, I think, one of the early seminal results in artificial intelligence. And I think, it clearly demonstrated the massive potential of artificial intelligence and machine learning to have sort of this transformational impact on what computers could do. And it's sort of, I'm sure we'll talk about this in a bit, but it didn't take very much imagination to sort of peer around the corner and imagine what would the implications be for life sciences, what would the implications be for medicine, what would the implications be for climate change, what would the implications be for sort of all these massive problems that were really at the heart of the future of humanity. And so I wanted to get engaged. I wanted to build things. I built a side project, a camera inside my refrigerator that would tell me when my roommates were going to steal my food. And I worked on that for, all of a few weeks before I realized that it was just incredibly difficult to actually build any sort of artificial intelligence, and the tools and the infrastructure just didn't exist. In particular, it was almost impossible to get the data that was necessary to build these systems. And so that was the inspiration.
Alexandr, just remind us, what year was that?
This was back in 2016.
2016, okay.
And this was, exactly. And that was the inspiration behind starting Scale. And fast forward to today, we're over 600 people strong, raised over $600 million, most recently at a $7 billion valuation, and work with incredible firms like Microsoft, PayPal, Square, Pinterest, Etsy, NVIDIA, and the whole lot. So it's been an exciting journey so far.
Well, look, firstly, congratulations. That's an incredible pace of growth, and obviously in the, absolutely the zeitgeist of the technology industry right now. I mean, it's a very competitive space, and to have started in 2016 is actually, in the scheme of the development of AI, it's quite late in that journey. So, I guess I've got two parts to the question. How did you, what was the first thing that you did that got you into the market? How did you find that initial foothold? And then we'll go into some of the other problems I know you've been looking at. But what was that critical turning point?
Yeah, so we were part of this startup accelerator called Y Combinator, and some of the wisdom that they teach you very early on at Y Combinator is to focus very, very finely on a very specific industry or a very specific problem that you can solve very, very well. And almost don't be concerned if that problem seems too small or doesn't seem nearly ambitious enough. If Y Combinator is full of very ambitious founders. And so for us, that ended up being focusing on autonomous vehicles and the problem of self-driving. And so, we became obsessed with this problem of how do we build and develop safe autonomous vehicles, given that artificial intelligence and AI is still now a relatively brittle technology. How are you supposed to build the proper data sets and approaches and infrastructure and methods to be able to enable safe autonomy? And so that was sort of the foothold market that ended up being sort of the launch pad that enabled us to solve the rest of the problems we've been able to tackle over time.
Got it. And when you think about that, I mean, I remember the first CogX Festival in 2017, where we were purely focused on AI, on its impact on industry, government, and society. And I remember in the opening session asking that question, how long is it going to be before we have fully autonomous cars? And I think the answer came back somewhere between 3 and 5 years. Obviously, this is the 6th edition, so, and we still don't, I think, have fully autonomous cars. Why is it so hard to get AI into live production? Like, you know, not narrow AI, but sophisticated AI, if you like, deep learning, new methods. What is the thing that's stopping that mass market deployment of this technology?
Yeah, you know, I think if you really look at it, it became increasingly clear, both in my own studies as well as in collaborating with many of these sort of leading organizations, that the data is sort of the fundamental building block that is critically missing. And this is true for a few reasons. But I think first, if you look at the technology first and foremost, if you look at all these incredible results that are happening today, or look at all these things that sort of the likes of OpenAI or DeepMind or Google AI or Meta AI are all releasing, they're fundamentally built off of these foundations of incredibly large data sets and these foundations of being able to use data in an incredibly rigorous and frankly transformational way. And if you think about most businesses or most enterprises, you know, data was never as important, nearly as important as it is today. You know, if you think about a business operating 50 years ago, they didn't have to operate on any data really, in nearly as fundamental a way as today. Then there's sort of the initial wave of,
Hey, Alexander, you back on?
Yeah, so sorry for that. I guess AI has not yet solved the problems that we needed to.
Yeah, so I think a fuse tripped here. It's probably, I don't know if they've got all the lighting back on, but probably something to do with the lighting on stage or something. But apologies for that. Now, you were mid-flow, and we were talking about how challenging it is to get AI into production. You were talking about the data that's required, and I would love to go and to talk about some specific industries. And then we were talking about the autonomous cars, right? And I know that's one you've spent a lot of time in, but we want to jump to some others. But you were mid-flow. Do you want to finish what you were saying?
Yeah, you know, I think the main thing that we see is that data ends up being sort of the fundamental bottleneck to real world AI deployments. And that's true across every single industry. And, you know, most businesses are really not built to be digitally native or data native in any reasonable way. And so this sort of, there's going to be this slow transformation over the course of the next few years for every traditional enterprise to become AI enabled. And if you look at the companies that are sort of the most successful today, they're the ones that treat data, you know, basically been built as data native businesses. So whether that's, you know, Amazon in e-commerce or Netflix in the media or TikTok and social media, you know, these businesses are modern, they're digital first, they're data native, and those end up being the ones that actually have the ability to scale AI to massive scale. They're also the ones who are reaping, you know, billions and billions of dollars of profit or value out of AI. And so I think that what we're going to see is this sort of democratization of that same technology over the course of the next few years.
And so it totally makes sense that digital native businesses are going to have, you know, a data lake, have the data in the right place in the right form to do stuff. So why don't we jump to an industry that probably doesn't? And I took a quick poll. I don't know if you could hear, but we're talking about different industries we could dig into. And one is obviously the government, right? So we you know, the UK government certainly has lots of different departments doing different things. But why don't you talk a little bit about maybe a use case in that domain?
Yeah, so I think one of them that's actually quite exciting is one that, you know, actually the UK is better positioned to solve than the United States government for a variety of reasons. But the NIH within the UK is actually working on being able to use sort of health data to be able to understand and better diagnose and understand both application towards life sciences, so application towards drug discovery and being able to identify better treatments for various health issues, as well as application to treatment and sort of healthcare. You know, how do you use the data that you have both collectively across an entire citizen base, as well as individually about each person to guide better healthcare for each specific individual. And that's something that, I think that's one government use case. There's a host of use cases both within national security, but the civilian use cases I think are going to be incredibly impactful. I think we've become, at least in the United States, speaking from experience, Americans have kind of become used to the idea that the government is bureaucratic and potentially not very helpful in many of these matters. But I think that, the hope is that with better technology and AI and the ability to utilize the massive data pools that the government has, there's going to be this ability to serve citizens significantly better in the future.
Well, I know we all hope you're right too, and that the UK is in a better position to do that. Are there any other specific examples you want to share around working with government?
Yeah, so one use case that we got very involved in recently was in the Ukraine conflict, and so we actually, one of the most important things in a conflict like Ukraine or any sort of disaster response or conflict scenario is to be able to react extremely quickly to the realities and facts on the ground. And there's been a huge amount of technology that's been built up over the past, frankly, many decades in the form of satellites and satellite imagery to be able to enable a very fast response and a very fast sort of humanitarian response. The issue is that if you actually dig into it in the United States, up until, frankly, even now, most satellite data needs to be looked at by a person before the government's able to actually act on it. So whether that's coordinating any sort of military response or coordinating any sort of humanitarian response, the satellite takes the image and you're literally waiting for an analyst in the United States to be able to look at that image.
Why is that?
And it's incredibly inefficient.
And so why do you need a human in the loop?
Ripe. Yeah, well, it's human in the loop, but it's incredibly ripe for artificial intelligence and algorithms to be able to automatically identify whatever's relevant in the imagery. The reality of satellite imagery is that, most of it is relatively uninteresting. And then every once in a while, you have something that's incredibly interesting and incredibly important that you need to pay attention to. And so we used our technology to analyze the major Ukrainian cities, Kiev, Kharkiv, Dnipro, and identify the damage that was the sort of cause as a result of the conflict at a building and structure by structure level to enable, a very targeted and pinpointed humanitarian response. And so that's been something that we've been extremely excited about and proud of, but also something that I think should just be standard in every sort of conflict or every sort of disaster scenario.
I mean, absolutely. It's an incredibly timely, obviously very relevant, given the tragic events in the Ukraine, and no question we'd all like to get humanitarian aid to the right place, quicker. What kind of size problem is that? Can you share anything about the volume of data you're dealing with or the frequency of that processing?
Yeah, I think some of this stuff is public, but if you look at the commercial satellite fleets that are launched and out there, many of them have the goal of being able to image every sort of inch of the Earth, so image the entire world every 24 hours. And there's a number of these fleets that are sort of operational and active. And so if you think about that, it's just an immense amount of imagery. The whole world is being imaged at a frequency faster than once every day, because there's multiple of these fleets sort of active at once. And so that's just an incredible amount of imagery, an incredible amount of data that needs to be processed by these algorithms. And the reality is, if we're reliant on the human in the loop approach, then maybe you look at less than 0.1% of all of this imagery, and you actually just discard the rest. But if you're able to use algorithms, you can have the algorithm prioritize and identify where might there be something that's worth a human looking at, and then actually coordinate a much finer grained response.
Let's just switch gears, because I want to make sure we have some time for questions, and I'm sure they'll come from across a range of topics. Let's just jump to the area of a sleepy industry. I asked the audience earlier, but insurance. I mean, insurance is a hugely important space. I mean, I was listening to an incredible talk actually the other day about how critical it is to the climate challenge, and how we keep everybody safe as sea levels rise and so on. But what have you been doing in insurance, and how do you get that industry AI enabled?
Yeah, so if you think about insurance, it actually, to my earlier point about data native or data first businesses, insurance actually historically is one of the industries that was most data centric, or relied the most on being able to perform advanced statistics or advanced data analyses across a wide spectrum of customers. And so I think these are businesses that want to reap the gains of AI and want to understand how AI can help improve their businesses. And I think that positions them well to actually be able to take advantage of some of these gains. But if you think about if you take a deep dive into any one of these insurance businesses, the sort of process by which claims become adjudicated looks very similar to what I just described about satellite imagery in the United States government, in the sense that every single claim, every single issue that one of these insurance companies needs to resolve involves this sort of labyrinthine process of going from person to person to person to person to sort of go through this bureaucratic process of identifying how much can the insurance company reimburse you in any given scenario. And it's one of these cases that is almost perfectly molded for modern artificial intelligence, which is taking all sorts of unstructured data, whether that's photos of the car or other sorts of property, audio from calls from the adjusters, doctor's notes, lawyers' documents, etc., to be able to sort of adjudicate and identify what is the appropriate payment amount. A similar approach as well to tie together some of the things that we've been talking about is there are a few insurance companies that are actually looking ahead and, to your point, thinking about the sort of the climate issue. And there's a particularly innovative approach that some of these insurance companies have taken on, which is to not wait for a disaster to occur. Sorry about that. Not wait for a disaster to occur, but to instead use satellite data and other sensors to identify when is the climate situation getting worse, and be able to proactively pay out when we notice that there's climate change, or we notice that there is a potential increase in natural disasters, or a number of these sort of satellite or just like climate-based indices. And it's quite an innovative approach to insurance, actually, and it's only enabled because you can have AI that's constantly monitoring satellite imagery, forestry, looking at the soil in agronomy cases or agriculture cases, and have this sort of always-on intelligence to be able to identify when is there sort of a degradation that requires some level of reimbursement.
It's fascinating, and obviously there's a much bigger topic there around insurance and climate, which we won't have time to get into this time. Just when you think about your technology, and we have quite a technical audience here, having started around AI, what is the hardest challenge that you guys find yourself facing across these different industries, and what is unique about what you've done at scale and how you're solving that? Because as I said, there's a lot of companies trying to be winners in this space, build scalable platforms and so on. So it would be great just to dig into like some of the technical detail and what makes your approach unique.
Yeah. So to be super specific, so I think at the sort of highest level, the thing that we ended up focusing on the most was the data, and I've sort of been talking about data in various forms throughout this conversation. But I think the first insight was to be incredibly data centric, which is basically fueled by the belief that if you look at any of these modern algorithms, what's the thing that has the greatest impact to their performance at the end of the day? That really all comes down to the data and the data quality. And then I think you take one click deeper on the data, the realization was that high quality data and extremely high quality, almost impeccable data sets comes from this sort of collaboration between algorithms and humans in the loop that is fundamentally, difficult. And this combination of both operationally challenging, you need to figure out how to get humans to look through data and process it in a very high quality way, as well as a deep technical challenge. How do you automate as much of the process as possible and automate as much of the quality control process as possible in the pursuit of building very high quality data sets? So the key insight that I think has fueled a lot of our growth and a lot of our success as a company is that this this combination of operational know-how and almost treating this like a manufacturing problem, in addition to taking advantage of the sort of bleeding edge insights from the AI research community, that the sort of like combination of those two disciplines has enabled us to, across all of these industries, build and create infrastructure that enables significantly higher quality data sets and therefore significantly higher quality models than is otherwise possible without sort of this marriage of disciplines.
Got it. That makes total sense. And just switching gears for a second, you've taken the company to 600 people. I think you said you had a 7 billion valuation, and you've raised a huge amount of money. This is a huge amount of success to have in a very short period of time. What is next for Scale?
Yeah, I think that our view, if you sort of take a big step back in the realm of AI, and there's actually timely given some of the recent news about sort of Google's AI algorithm and sort of the news around that. But our view is that there's an incredible number of very smart people working on artificial intelligence. There's no doubt about that, and sort of the research is absolutely incredible and is being done by incredibly brilliant people. But there's sort of if you look at the industry, most of the brightest people are sort of focused on these time horizons and these results that are almost too far away to be really relevant today. I think we're a lot of the sort of like leading AI organizations are sort of thinking about this world when we have AGI, when if you look today, we sort of have slowing GDP growth and slowing productivity growth in most of the developed countries in the world. And so our view is really that AI has already reached a point of being incredibly, incredibly impactful and valuable. The technology is already useful enough where it can transform many of these industries that I talked about, transform the government and how we approach humanitarian response, transform insurance, transform agriculture, transform all of these industries that are at the core of many of the greatest issues that we face today as a society. And our goal is really, how do we deploy the technology that exists today in as wide a scale as possible, as quickly as possible? And that's really the focus. And I think one of the things that we hope, many other companies also join us in, because I think it's going to be impossible for anyone to do it alone.
So it's solving today's problems. Obviously, fantastic to look at tomorrow and the future. And we have a purpose and a focus here at the festival, which is addressing the question: how do we get the next 10 years right? But so for you, it's really looking at what can be solved today with the technology we have today, with the data that we can take advantage of. Fantastic. I'm going to open it up to the audience. Do we have a microphone here? Brilliant. So do we have any questions? If you just put your hand up. There's one here.
I'd like to get back to the human-in-the-loop issue. Quick two-part question. Could you comment a bit on the logistical issue of getting it from the, for instance, you were talking about the satellite images back to the human, and possibly even feedback from the human back to the modelers, and then a little bit about the type of human. Like, it could be an architect, it could be somebody that's a very experienced annotator. Just very curious about that part of the process.
Thank you.
I think what we find is that you want a mixture of approaches, or ideally you want a mixture of approaches. So I think that if you look at most of these use cases, there do exist experts who have sort of this incredibly deep encyclopedic knowledge of whatever data is relevant for that particular use case. So for example, for satellite imagery, there do exist people who work in many of the governments, many of the leading, or basically every government, who have basically this encyclopedic knowledge of what different sorts of satellite imagery look like. And you want them to be as high leverage as possible. And so the general approach, more or less, is to utilize sort of these expert humans and bring them into the loop, but enable them to be as sort of scalable as possible by minimizing the amount of data that they need to look at while maximizing the performance improvement on the model. So that at a very high level, that's kind of the approach. And then at a technical level, there's a number of sort of things that you do in sort of setting up the overall life cycle and infrastructure to enable that to be true.
Do we have another question? There's one here over on the left. On the left by the wall here. Yep. Thank you.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask, I guess, about data as a commodity. Like, how do you see this developing? I know you mentioned these big businesses that have huge data sets and big access, if you will, to leveraging those data sets. But how, I guess, do smaller companies play and leverage on what data the big companies have collected? And where do you see the role for kind of entrepreneurs like yourself, maybe working in other fields, to do that and bring that about and maybe make some impact in their fields? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is an incredible question, actually, and something that I'm quite passionate about. I think there was this term that was coined a few years ago that data was the new oil, which I think is the exact wrong analogy, because oil is a true commodity. Oil from one place looks the exact same as oil from another place. But the nuance about data is that data is it's extremely relevant what exact domain data comes from. So if you maybe look at sort of like data scraped off of the internet, like data from Reddit or data scraped off of Amazon or whatnot, that's incredibly abundant. And so, it's possible for these large companies to build these large data pools from those data sets. But then if you look at these specific data sets that are necessary to solve some of these really big problems, like in healthcare, or you look at like agriculture data sets, et cetera, they're incredibly scarce and they basically don't exist. The data sets in healthcare are almost laughable to most machine learning engineers who try to get involved in that sort of problem domain. And so I think there's actually still an incredible opportunity for entrepreneurs to build companies based around these sort of these areas where there's incredible data scarcity, or for whatever reason these pools of data don't exist, and really bring these industries from 0 to 1 in terms of A, data abundance, and then B, machine learning applied to those problems.
Thank you for that answer. Have we got any more questions? We've only got a couple of minutes left. Any other questions, audience? One at the back here, on the left-hand side.
So I can't quite remember the exact title of the talk, but I was wondering, how quite did you scale AI so fast? Like, what was if you could summarize it in a tweet, what was it that propelled you so fast?
I think that at its core, first of all, artificial intelligence as an industry and as a field has, I think, surprised all of us, those within the field, those outside of the field, in terms of how quickly the sort of capabilities have scaled and how quickly the sort of the technology has developed. So I think that's sort of the fundamental backdrop. And then I think the other piece to it, frankly, has come from this sort of wisdom that I mentioned early on, which is to actually focus very deeply on sort of problem after problem after problem in sort of more of a serial way, rather than try to boil the ocean all at once. And so again, we started with autonomous vehicles, and that was the initial focus. And then we moved on to working with some of the large tech companies on problems like e-commerce, and that was the next focus. And then we worked on government problems, and that was sort of the next focus. But each of these, now we've been around for some time, so when I list all these off, maybe it seems like we've been working on these, all of these the whole time, but actually it's sort of this very deliberate, slow expansion so that we can make sure that each area we were actually able to have a substantive impact and actually able to sort of build momentum sequentially, industry by industry. And I think that fundamentally has been probably one of the core operational differentiators of scale relative to many other artificial intelligence companies has been our sort of our ability to focus, but also to grow sort of in these concentric circles rather than trying to sort of throw paint at the wall and cover the entire surface.
So focus and getting one industry knocked down and then moving on to the next one. Brilliant. If we don't have any other questions, I know we're out of our formal time. I actually had a couple of follow-up questions for you, Alexandr. The first one is, if you had to give advice to other entrepreneurs looking at the AI space, where do you see the opportunities for, individual founders, co-founders, small teams to go and do something great right now? What advice would you share with the audience?
Yeah, I think that, again, the backdrop is just one where the artificial intelligence industry is growing sort of astronomically quickly. I think it's, you'd be hard pressed to point to an industry or sector that's growing as quickly and has as large a potential to provide fundamental value to humanity. And that's a little bit of a subtweet at crypto. But I think that there's this massive fundamental potential to artificial intelligence. So I think that, there's sort of going to be an abundance of opportunity, and by the nature of startups, it's almost hard for any one person to identify where the nooks or crannies or sort of like or green fields exist in that sort of in that overall race. That being said, I think that kind of what I mentioned before, which is that all of these industries, most industries are very data scarce, and so I think that there's always going to be an opportunity to actually bring artificial intelligence to as many of these industries as possible. And I think there's going to be, somewhat of a go fast to go, or go slow to go fast within each industry, because these industries are, they're each dealing with the advent of AI. They're this is sort of a transformation that we're sort of midstream in. But I think that broadly speaking, over the course of a decade or 2 decades, is going to be one of the greatest transformational changes that I think many of us witness.
Well, thank you. And Alexandr, look, I just wanted to say congratulations. Obviously, this is an incredibly impressive business you built. AI is a really huge topic here, so it's great to have you here. My final question is, are we going to see you with us in person next year?
I really apologize for having missed this in person this time, and I really hope to be able to make it there in person next year. And that way, my head will be smaller, but there will be no technical difficulties. That's the dream.
Brilliant. Well, listen, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations, Alexandr Wang, Scale AI.